right, so we're going to be talking about coding and N-vivo in particular. What I call the crash course on qualitative coding is meant to be very practical in the sense that I will, explain certain mechanics and, features of working with words contained within published articles, enough so you are equipped with the resources and the knowledge to do the analysis itself. But before all of that, before talking about N-vivo, before talking about the different strategies for understanding the meaning of particular text, I think it's important to talk about broadly, theory, description, interpretation, how have certain methodological texts defined, what coding is, to give us sort of a language to talk about this sort of thing, which is very different from other types of analyses. So it's really for this coding presentation, it's really about talking about some strategies for qualitative coding, differentiating between two concepts concepts and processes that we undergo cognitively that are very much overlapping: description on the one hand and interpretation on the other hand. And the reason why I talk about this in a little bit of detail is because before I went into my journey on understanding what qualitative coding is, I implicitly knew the difference between describing something, interpret as something, but the conversation about what these two actually mean for research, for life, for anything really, helped me to narrow down how I can leverage the different strategies of coding to reveal nuances and concepts that were sort of hidden before. And then just talking about some principles of coding, particularly in what we call initial or open coding. There are some things to keep in mind that go against some of the things we're used to as researchers, or things we might be used to as researchers in other sort of methodologies and methods. So description versus interpretation. And this sort of discussion may seem a bit low level, being like, okay, your reaction may be, yeah, I know what this means. I know what the difference is between description and interpretation. But I just really want to narrow down the language and the processes that we undergo cognitively that will help us when we actually code in a relatively consistent manner later on. So description is very much the dictionary definition. It is basically that when you describe something, the way you describe it is almost identical to another person from another context is describing that particular object or particular idea or theme. Very much a dictionary definition, that's how I describe it. And then the interpretation, on the other hand, goes a bit further. It goes towards, the judgments you make, the values that are associated with the particular object or idea. How is your personal context influencing how you look at a particular concept, a particular expression from a participant, a particular idea that you see in multiple articles? How is you being a physician or being a researcher or being a scientist influencing that context? And that's where interpretation comes in. Another sort of interesting way of thinking about interpretation is that when you translate knowledge on a particular topic to different audiences, you undergo a little bit of interpretation here because you tailor that conversation to the particular context, and that requires changing the wording and the framing of certain ways of certain things that you're discussing. So you may not use jargon that's particular to opioid use disorder to a decision maker, for example, and that in itself, we put that under interpretation because you are making a value judgment about whether or not this would be helpful for making the particular argument you are making. One important point here is that, as you can see, interpretation is very much dependent upon description. That to interpret, you first must describe. But you don't need to interpret everything. You can just leave at description if you think that's what your goal is for a particular research activity. But if you want to go higher level, you're going to have to do high quality description. And we'll talk about that later on with regards to our coding, our purposes in our coding. But just a sort of like a example, let's imagine that you see this in front of you. So how would you describe this? I would just say that I'm not sure if it's made out of glass because it is a picture. I can't feel it myself, so there's a little bit of interpretation going on there based on, how you think that, bottles with certain liquids with certain sort of reflections are usually made out of a glass. Therefore, this is probably made out of glass, and you use the word probably in the right context. Whenever you use probably, you should be like, okay, maybe I'm interpreting something. The other thing is that I'm not sure if it's a liquid. It could be a white solid inside too, right? So you have not physically felt that, and that's something that someone might disagree upon. If you're saying that this is a white liquid, I might say it could be a white solid. We have to test it out to see, and that's where the interpretation comes in. You're probably thinking this is milk, for example. It could very much well be milk, but it could also be other white liquids that I'm not sure, or it could be different types of milk, right? These are all examples of descriptions versus interpretations. All right, so these are just some questions that help you to differentiate between description and interpretation. So I won't go through all of it, but things like, what is this? What are its features? As opposed to interpretation, which is on the right, which is like, what does this mean? What does it say? Who knows and how? And things of that nature. But I think we're on the same page with regards to description interpretation. So I will gloss over this into the next slide. Okay, so getting into coding, I think it's also helpful to define coding as it has been conceptualized in sort of methodological texts that are most commonly used in qualitative research. So the two definitions I have here are from Kathy Shermaz, who is sort of like, I would say the author of constructivist grounded theory. So not grounded theory in particular, but constructivist grounded theory. And I won't get into the differences between constructivists and non-constructivists. That's a bit too much, even for me. The second one is from Johnny Saldana, and that's basically a book which is sort of understood as a manual for qualitative coding. So it's all about strategies, all about principles, less about philosophy and more about, okay, this is what you need to do mechanically for your particular objective. And so I'll read each of them, and then I'll identify what the commonality is. So Sharma says it's about coding is naming segments of data with a label that simultaneously categorizes, summarizes, and accounts for each piece of data. And then Johnny Saldana says a coding is a word or short phrase that symbolically assigned a summative, salient, essence capturing, and evocative attribute for a portion of language or visual data. And if you look at both of these, they're saying very similar things, and the essence of it is you're putting a label on a particular idea, right? When participants says something, they usually don't say it in a very coherent manner. So you have to look at what they're saying and try to attribute a particular concept, a particular idea that represents what they're saying holistically. And that label that you put on, that's what we call a code. The process that you go through cognitively to put a label on is called coding. And of course, there's several other definitions of coding. I felt that these are the easiest to really understand, specifically for our goals. Yeah, okay. One important thing about coding is that it is methodologically, we don't think of it as analysis itself. We think of it as a way to do analysis. And so a metaphor that I heard somewhere that I don't recall is thinking of like, physically writing something down. Physically writing something down, being able to write something as kids learn to do, does not mean they can write well. They can write eloquently. So the physical act of printing is what you say is coding, but writing well, that's where the analysis comes in, and that's very much for the most part, it's in your head. It's cognitively, but of course, there's certain things you can do mechanically using N-vivo or using Microsoft Word, or diagramming and creating flowcharts that allows you cognitively to analyze in different ways. But important distinction: coding is not necessarily analysis, it is process through which we analyze. Okay, another important point here and why I mentioned this is because I cannot count how many times where I have introduced coding to individuals for a particular project and they stress out so much. And it's very overwhelming for any individual who's new to coding. It's overwhelming for me every single time, even though I've coded for like 60, 70 projects now. Every project I experience exhaustion, I experience confusion, I experience ambiguity. But why I mentioned this is I wanted to identify it and I wanted to recognize it at this very moment. So this is taken from my master supervisor from McMaster University. And it was basically, you know, this is your capacity to handle information as you look at more and more data, so more and more articles in our case, you have a specific capacity, but there's so much more data that we're going to look at. So that's the period of, that's the inevitable gap, or what she says, period of despair. That's the confusion and that's the ambiguity that you see. But eventually it goes down with time. You start to understand things and so forth. And that's where realization comes. That's where comfort comes and so forth. Moving forward into a few other things, last few slides, and then we'll get into N-vivo. So this is another way to look at what you might be going through. So just read that tweet. So let's talk about the stages of coding. So a lot of the stuff we've already discussed, but I will try to reiterate it using some of the language that's used in the methodological text. So there's really two stages. One is the first step, the initial coding, or some texts say open coding. And there are differences between initial and open coding, but for the purposes of our project, we'll just keep them the same. And focused coding, which comes afterwards. If you want to think about, you know, description versus interpretation, initial coding is more descriptive, focus coding is more interpretive. Though there is description and interpretation in both stages, it's just what's the level of analysis we are doing. And there's a bunch of notes here that you have accessible to you that you want to look at. I won't go through everything. But essentially initial coding is, like I said, going line by line and putting a label to everything. And in the next slide, I'll talk about specific, you know, strategies you can use when you're doing line by line that allows you to attribute labels and like sort of refrain from interpreting too much at that moment. But it's very much, you know, trying to think of it like paraphrasing. I read a sentence, I paraphrase it, right? I summarize it. What's the essence of being said? It's very simple as that. And we paraphrase and summarize all the time. But for our purposes, what our initial coding is, like, we have to actually put a physical label onto that paraphrase, onto our summary. So yeah, line by coding I've discussed generally, and that's usually the most common way to do things. And I will say that line by line coding doesn't necessarily only mean literally line by line, because, you know, a sentence can span multiple lines, especially if it is a published article, which are usually in multiple comments in 2 or 3 columns. A sentence can go to like 4, 5, 6 lines. So usually I'm a bit flexible about this. It's not being restricted to a line, but a sentence maybe, or maybe 2 sentences, maybe a 1.5 sentences. And I'm guided by my understanding of it. So if I see a line and I'm gonna go like, oh, this means, you know, personal motivations of the patient, but the next line also talks about it, I'll just go like, okay, this entire 2 sentences or 3 sentences or paragraph with the quote is personal motivations. And this will make a bit more sense when I go to the N-vivo file, but just take this for now. The other ways, which we will likely not do, but it really depends on the research objectives, are word by word coding. That's when you want to really look at how words are used. And that may be, if I think about it, that may be, if we're interested, maybe specific, maybe useful for looking at our articles from, you know, back in the 1970s, 80s, 90s versus today. The word by word coding strategy may be a bit useful because I suspect they use similar words in different ways. And there's also incident by incident coding, and that's usually for the there are research projects where there's like a storyline that's present, or you're interested in developing a timeline from beginning to the end. So for example, I'm doing a qualitative review on how individuals who have a family member who in palliative care, so they're, you know, inevitable death, they're expected death. What is the timeline? What are the events that trigger grief that occurs before the actual death, right? So I'm looking at time of diagnosis, when they realize that, you know, death is coming, when they go to, you know, do caregiving activities. Like, these are all like specific timelines that, you know, go one before the other. And so I'm gonna use that as a framework to do incident by incident coding. So it's just a way to organize data. But I suspect it might not be relevant here, but mentioning that for your reference there. And last thing, there are N-vivo codes, and this is something we discussed in previous meeting, and that's essentially using what's being mentioned by participants as codes and labels themselves. So in the CADITH report, I use this example when I talk about coding. There was like a paragraph and a quote, and that was just talking about, you know, how a patient was like, I'm motivated to engage in treatment. I want treatment. And I think I have, you know, the mental space to do treatment. And in the quote, they said treatment readiness. They used that exact word, treatment readiness. And although it was like 100 or 50 or 100 words, that entire thing, I just took treatment readiness and made that a code for the paragraph. That's an N-vivo code right there. And why that's helpful is because it keeps you grounded in the data in a specific manner, but also treatment readiness, when we're writing, it can be very powerful in that you convey that this is how the patient has described their situation, and this is how we're choosing to describe it as well. Quotes tend to be a lot more nuanced and a lot more elaborate than the words we write when it comes to a QES. Okay, principles and guidelines for initial coding. So these are very general things you have to keep in mind. So when you do initial coding, maybe keep this slide on the side to just remind you implicitly that you have to consider these things when you read through the text. Very broadly, you have to remain open to what you're thinking. I have noticed that in some cases, certain people evaluate their own judgments too harshly. And though that's fine for anything else in life, for coding in particular, we want to welcome, recognize, and bring about and pursue those things that you think about. We don't want to judge them too harshly. We don't want to say this is wrong, this is incorrect, this is right. We want to say that, oh, this is what I see. Let's see if this can lead to another thing. Right? So be very open to all the things that you're thinking about. Be very open and reflective about the ideas that are coming in your head when you're looking at experiences of people. And I can say that, you know, when you read a quote, it brings about a lot of thoughts, especially for practitioners in the area. It'll bring about a lot of thoughts, a lot of experiences of yourself, a lot of, you know, the specific stereotypes that you have. I'm not using stereotypes in a negative way in this context. I'm saying, you know, we have stereotypes of how, you know, things exist and work in the world, and that's very important to keep in mind because they'll influence how you understand what you see. So you have to remain open to those particular stereotypes and don't think of those stereotypes as negative in any way. So you have to stay close to the data. So that's the line by line, the sentence by sentence coding. That's what that does. The N-vivo codes, that's what it allows you to do. But even explicitly saying that I have to remain to that data. Like, for example, sometimes I see myself, I read a quote and I start going down a pathway, like, oh, this means this means that. If I'm in initial coding, I have to bring myself back. That's completely fine in the later coding cycles, but I have to bring myself back in initial coding, because if you do that in the initial coding process, you're going to be spending hours and hours and hours on one article or one section. Therefore, you have to be like, what is my first impression about this? Label it, move on. And that goes to one of the points below. You have to really move quickly through the data. You have to use your spontaneity, your initial impressions. If you get too deep into the data, you get to interpretation, which we don't want to do at this point, but you also become inefficient. right? You have to code so much there. We're going to have so many articles, and if you code everything deeply, then this, like Fabio mentioned, it's going to take, the cycle of the solar system. So comparing data with data, I think you can understand that. So you're comparing sentences with sentences, you're comparing quotes with what the authors are saying, and vice versa. So going back and forth with the levels of analyses. Another thing to keep in mind that in paragraphs there can be multiple ideas, multiple codes. So one paragraph can have 5 codes, 6 codes, or it will also have 1 code. And that's really dependent on you and how you are choosing to understand what's being said. Code can capture a word, a line, or a whole paragraph. That's very similar. Very important point is once we get further deeper into the analysis, it's very important to keep in mind that we'll sort of develop a framework inductively based on our pilot coding. So that'll be a schema, right? And that's just our initial impressions and where the major. But once we have a framework and once it's becoming more saturated and robust, we don't want to use that framework to judge our data. We don't want to say that, oh, this particular code from the 29th article does not fit with their schema, so I'm excluding it. No. Those codes are very, very important because usually the codes that are mentioned very sparingly offer quite a bit of nuance to the entire experience or the entire theme that we're looking at. The question becomes, how do we integrate it within the schema that we have developed? And that integration in of itself pushes our analysis forward. Do not code individuals. I'll keep it that there because it's a very complex idea, and this is taken from like other contexts in which I do training and coding, but it's not relevant for our purposes. But if it does become relevant, I'll bring about and we'll talk about that. Okay, what's the time? Okay, 2 o'clock. Cool. So the second stage is focused coding. And the new things I want to mention here, you can read all the notes here. How I'll describe focused coding with the next slide is essentially by the end of our initial coding, we'll have some sort of a schema. It'll have, let's say, 6, 7 themes. Under each theme might be multiple sub-themes. And under sub-themes, maybe like nuances or concepts or ideas or things of that nature. But now we're comfortable with these 6 themes, let's say. Then what we want to do is we want to revisit those themes. So we'll have a bunch of buckets for each theme. And in the buckets, there are like the codes that we've taken from articles in N-vivo. We're going to look at each of those themes and try to better understand just that theme, just that coherent bucket, excluding everything else we've looked at. And that's what focus coding really is. It's really focusing you on that theme that you have decided should be a theme. Whereas initial coding is like, oh, I'm looking at so many things, like trying to make sense of everything. There's so many different ideas and concepts. Focus coding is like, okay, we've identified this theme. Now we're going to be specifically analyzing that theme with respect to itself. And that's going deeper in that theme. Whereas before, we weren't able to go deeper because there's so many different ideas coming in our head, because there's so many different themes. Now within each theme, we're allowed to go deeper and delve in and interpret what this really means, interpret how to represent it, interpret the relevance to OED treatments, OED practice, etc. But as we review all the stuff, the deliverable is creating a narrative summary of each theme. And that's very much how you've seen in qualitative manuscripts, that each theme has a description, it has quotes, has what the author thinks, etc. That is a narrative summary. So once we have all these summaries for each of the 6 themes, one person will look at all these summaries and make them consistent in writing style and format, but as well as make sure that the timeline, the chronology of those themes makes sense, that similar themes are grouped together, any overlaps are mentioned, We have quotes for things that we think are very powerful and relevant, and that's where it results. All right. Okay. So let's talk about N-vivo. A few disclaimers here. One which we have discussed is the latest version of the N-vivo. So older N-vivo files are going to be quite a bit different in terms of the compatibility, in terms of the functions that you see. The other thing is, if you're using Windows, it might be a bit different from Mac users in terms of how it's displayed and where things are. But generally, I think that with common sense, you should be able to figure out where certain features are. It's not a big deal, but if you can't find it, then just let me know and we'll work through that. The other thing is, and I always forget the way it goes, I believe, yeah, the other thing is that Word individuals who use Windows can open Mac files. It's so you can use Windows files and Mac files. Individuals with a Mac, if they want to open up a Windows file, the person who made that file has to convert it to a Mac version. That's, I think, still exists as a problem. So keep that in mind. If you use a Mac, I use a Mac, so generally, I think what we've done is just convert everything to a Mac version, which is identified by .nvpx, I believe, or is it the other way around? Yeah, it's nvpx, whereas Windows is without the X, so just nvp. So usually what we do, if there's anyone using a Mac, we just convert it to nvpx files always, so everyone can access it. Yeah, so I don't know all the functions in N-vivo. It's too much, and I would say 80% of the functions I don't think are useful at all. The one function that is irrelevant for our purposes that I found useful was for making word clouds. Sometimes word clouds are really helpful for presentations, so I put in a bunch of stuff and it automatically generates a bunch of word clouds for me, and they're very nice. So if you ever want to make a word cloud that's better than Google, the stuff you see on Google, then you can use N-vivo. Yeah, so a few things we're going to talk about in terms of layout. So all the stuff we're not going to necessarily look at. The ones that are most relevant are files, nodes, and memos. So I won't go into everything else. I'll just focus on what's most relevant. So if you click on files, this is basically where all the included studies will be the PDF. So we'll import the PDFs here. And I have done that already for 3 supposedly included articles from our list. So if you click on any one of them, the PDF should show here. Yeah, and it should be the entire PDF. So one important thing here is that, as you can notice, if you click on the PDF, you should be able to highlight it. So highlighting different sections. And that's the mechanical aspect of coding that I will talk about in a few minutes. So PDF and highlighting, very important, which you do via files. So nodes you'll see right here under this a bunch of these sort of what I call buckets. So nodes are basically the buckets that I've been talking about in the coding presentation. And there are specific terms that we use for these nodes. So the ones you see here are what we call parent nodes. And then there are a bunch of nodes underneath that we'll call daughter nodes. I'm not sure where that comes from, but like, why aren't they son nodes? Why aren't they, why does it have to be daughter nodes in particular? Probably sounds better, that's why. And then you can make granddaughter nodes that go further, and the great-granddaughter nodes, however deeper you want to go. But that's how usually we talk about it. But these are essentially the buckets which contain everything. So you can name these nodes. So there's a few ways to do it. So the nodes are already made. But if I were to create a new node, I right-click and I say new top-level node. And then this should appear. And then you have name, you have description. Aggregating codes from child nodes. Okay, so they're using child nodes in the newest version. Okay, that's cool. In the previous versions, they used daughter nodes. So I'll call them child nodes now. So what this really means is that all the child nodes that are underneath that may refer to specific sub-themes will be aggregated and included in the biggest parent node. So if you think of the parent node as a theme, and then child nodes as sub-themes, and the parent node has all the codes within the child nodes. That's simply what it is, but you have to click it to make that. Sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't. But yeah, let me just say personal one, and done. That's the node. And you have a bunch of details here as well, right? Modified by who, created on when, the number of references and the number of files from which you've coded in here. Okay, so I'm just going to delete this. So there's a bunch of nodes here already. The extraction node, what I mentioned earlier, is that initial bucket where everything goes in. So essentially, you're going to be reading the articles, and you're just going to be taking whatever's relevant and dragging and dropping there. So let me show you how that's done. So let's go to the results section. So this is the results. All this is demographic data, so not necessarily codable. But now I'm going to go to this section. So motivations for non-prescribed buprenorphine use. Zoom in so you can see better. Okay. So let's just say that, I won't read through all of it, but let's just say that this is something I am classifying as a motivation, which, I mean, in this case, that's right. But I classify it as an external motivation that, it's talking about factors beyond that person associated with the program, with finances, with, things of that nature. And there's a code here too, right? So what I'm going to choose to do is highlight all of this, hold it right here, and then you can see on my mouse that I have something right there. That's when you know you have whatever you've highlighted on your mouse. Go to your particular node. In this case, we'll start with extraction, and then just release the click. Simple as that. That's one way to do it. I'll describe another way to do it that's a bit useful later down the line. But for extraction, this is the primary where you're going to be doing it, because you're going to be putting that particular code into just one bucket. But there's another way to do something that I'll describe in a few minutes that is more useful when you're putting one code into multiple buckets. But one thing I wanted to mention before I said that was, as you can see, two things here. One, I've coded a paragraph with one code. This is how I understood it. I said, this is external motivations. Two, I coded the heading, because heading can be an important summary of that particular code. So I usually include the heading every single time when it's the start of a particular section. And three, I've included a quote as well, because the quote, although may not be included in our final report manuscript, it provides quite a bit of context and a lot of nuance that the authors will not provide. So the author being the paragraph itself. Like, these are all the author's words. The context that the quote provides adds so much nuance to what the author is saying, which is supposedly an interpretation and possibly a summary in some context. So I code both of those together, because putting it together allows me to associate that later down the line. Another very important point is the degree to which you code. So I have given the impression that we're doing line by line, sentence by sentence coding. With N-vivo, it is a bit different, because if you can imagine, what we choose to code and extract at this stage will influence how we are able to code later down the line. So if we code just the term buprenorphine and put it in the extraction folder, we're not necessarily going to see all of this other good stuff. Therefore, we have to, read it as a holistic whole and code for broad context. That's what we say, coding for broad context. And again, I'll show a feature that sort of like addresses that the context issue if it arises later in the future. But generally, you want to be as encompassing and as broad as possible. And the best way I can tell you, there's no clear-cut rule, and the best way I can tell you is it really depends upon how you've chosen to label it. If you think that the next paragraph is not external, it's more personal motivations, then don't put that with this code. Just put that into two separate codes, but make sure the context for each code is good. So let me see if I missed anything here. Yeah, so I've dragged and dropped it. Now, if I click, actually, so I'm going to drag and drop the next one too. And be careful here. The page ends. There's a quote. I coded the quote with the paragraph, but there's another quote here for some reason. So let's say I've read it, and let's say it's associated with that previous covering paragraph. So I've coded that. I want to code that too. So I'm going to stop there. But now let's click on the node, extraction. So this is what you see when you look at each node. The very top is sort of, it will be the name of that article. So it'll likely be like the last author, last name of the first author and the year. And this is also a hyperlink to the PDF itself within N-vivo, and I'll talk about that shortly. This is just how many things you've chosen to code from that article. So I've got 3, right? Because I've taken 3, I've dragged and dropped 3 things. And then what percentage of the article has been coded? 2.419%. But as you can see, it's like the exact same thing as the PDF, and this is where we're going to be working from. An important point here is once we've extracted all the data, we're working from here for our further initial coding. And I can do the same thing what I did in the PDF with this, with the extraction, with the node sort of display. So I classify this as an external motivation. For example, I'm going to highlight this. Now I have this, and you can see the little bit of, lighter color writing. That's when you have it on your mouse. And I'm going to take it to the external folder and drop it there. Done. And you should see like a message here, coded at externals. That's just acknowledging that you've done it. So the next one, I coded that as, say, click and drag, drop there. And this quote was also associated with that personal motivation, so I'm going to drag and drop there too. Important point here, very minor point here, is why I chose to code this and this separately is because of the page break. If you just highlight all of it together, you're going to get a bunch of like page numbers and like footnotes and everything. It's going to, that's going to like really divide up the what came in the first page versus what came in the second page. So I just split that up, but I recall that, if there's just a quote here that someone has just coded the quote, then that's likely associated with the previous code. And especially so because if you notice, all the codes that you do is in the same order as they appear in the article. So this comes before this, which comes before this. So let me go back to, okay, so what I'm going to show you now is another way to do to drag and drop, and this is particularly helpful after the extraction phase. So essentially, in the extraction phase, you're putting everything into one bucket and one bucket only. So you can drag and drop, very quick, very easy. But later down the line, you may be like, okay, I need to put this into multiple buckets, but because this appears to be under multiple themes because it's so complex. But because that tension is a bit difficult, that this I may have originally classified this as external motivations, but there may be elements of external motivations and very different themes. But if you just choose the external motivation part and choose the other part that's relevant to the other theme and code that separately, you're removing the context that's contained within this one code, right? So the best way to really do it is just to code the same exact thing in multiple pages. And you do that by right-clicking. So highlight all of this, right-click, where's it? Code selection, add existing nodes or cases. And just a note here, you can also create a new node through this mechanism as well. But I'll describe the existing nodes or cases. And then this screen should appear. I want to code it in extraction, let's say, because it's missing a code nav since I deleted all the codes. And I want to code it in motivations, let's say, because it doesn't have the codes either. And I'm just going to click on, select those two, and that's it. And now you can see it's in both. Way to do this is usually just, if you're tired of dragging and dropping, you can just like quick select the relevant nodes here. But you can only do that one at a time. That's particularly helpful if you imagine when there's like 50 nodes, which happens usually in the middle of our coding when there's 50 nodes, and then you have to like scroll up and down and then drag and drop. It becomes very onerous. So you can just like right click, code selection, and put in the right code and just keep doing that. So two more things to discuss. Memos and, oh, right, a few more things to discuss. Okay, so let me go back to the PDF. Abby mentioned that we're going to be coding the results, the discussion, and the conclusion sections. And that's very right. Usually the conclusion section, I put that in just in case, because sometimes in qualitative papers, the conclusion sections are labeled as conclusion, but they're actually providing recommendations or implications. So you have to be a bit flexible in how authors or journals have chosen to format their papers. So 3 sections: results, discussion, and possibly conclusion. Results are the primary source of the data because most commonly they don't have, the authors are not bringing other outside sources. Sometimes they do actually, which is a bit annoying, but most often not is just, what the participants said and how the authors have chosen to interpret it. And that's, I think, is pretty straightforward. What gets a bit complicated is looking at the discussion section and how to code it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when it comes to QESs and qualitative metasyntheses, from the perspective of a reviewer, we are primarily interested in what the author is saying, but we are secondarily interested in what the participants are saying. Why we put the emphasis on the author is because we assume, and this is the best assumption we can make at this point because we don't have access to primary data. We assume that the author of that primary study has looked at the entire data and has summarized to us what they think is the most relevant to the research objectives. So they are positioned in a more appropriate role to look at holistically the research objectives over one particular participant or 2 participants specifically. So, and relatedly to that actually is that one quote is not the only thing that the participant is saying, but the author is using that quote to illustrate a particular code or concept. So just by coding participants, that's what I've actually seen a few qualitative reviews do, just coding the quotes that have been included in manuscripts actually misrepresents what the participants probably said, is because the author has chosen to interpret and only include certain quotes and not others. So you're doing a lot of disservice to the participants' participation within the original research study. And there's also quite a bit of ethical issues with that, which I will not get into, but I have sort of thought about that in my previous life about qualitative methods. But essentially, if you're one part of ethics for qualitative papers is you have to look at what the participant is saying as a whole and not misrepresent them in any way. And you have to, and there's certain ways to go back, like member checking, respondent validation, to ensure that what you're representing, they like it and things like that. These are all promoted for ethical reasons, because you don't want to go beyond what the participant wants to say. And specifically, that's even more important for sensitive issues. But if you do that in the review context, even though you are not seeking ethical approval, you are using published data, and misrepresenting something that went through ethical approval, it gets into a very, very gray area. That's why we focus on authors. And why that becomes problematic is because, as you can see in the discussion, there's a lot of references. So is what the author's saying in the discussion section all what they're saying? Or is it, sort of paraphrased outside literature, and what do you code and what do you not code? And that's really a judgment on the individual who's coding. Generally, there is that, actually, let me put the recommendation aside. Generally, what happens in discussion section is there's two things that are said, there's two ways, what's the right word? Two types of sentences, I would say. One is, this is what we found, this is what this research study says, and both of them are the same, identical, and therefore our research study is supported by outside literature, or the outside literature supports our study. That's one way a discussion section is framed, right? That's what I'll call statement of support. In that case, just focus on what the author has said, because essentially the author is saying that, this research study supports what we've said, but focus on what they've said about their own research study. And also, if they've included how it relates to their own research study, include that as well. Oftentimes what happens when it comes to the mechanics, you just code everything together and make sure that when you're doing your focus coding, you don't necessarily derive from the sentence or sentences that reference outside literature, but you use that as context to understand what is really being said. And the second way that authors usually say things are like recommendations or implications for practice, policy, research, etc. Those things are coded as a whole because those are authors' interpretations, right? What is the meaning of this stuff? How do I change my daily life in the profession? Things of that nature. And of course, if outside literature is included within recommendations, then you apply the same rule. But generally, recommendations and all these implications are what we consider findings in themselves, because if you think about it, they're very similar to the results section, because the results section, they're very much, you would say, looking at the data and summarizing it and maybe interpreting a little bit, but then the discussion section takes that even forward, but it's still an interpretation from those results. So it's very important to include that as well. Okay, so about the coding context, if, for instance, you see that later down the line that, oh, the person has only coded half of the quote. For whatever reason, the quote went missing, there's a glitch in N-vivo, you only see this part, let's say. So the quote starts here, ends there. And you're like, oh, I want to know what the other quote is about. There's two ways to do this. One is just click this. It takes you to the PDF, and it highlights the codes that you've coded. Simple as that. Other way, which is a new feature in N-vivo, and I used it a little bit and I don't necessarily trust it, probably because it's new, is the coding context. So right click, go coding context, broad. Don't do entire because that gives you the entire article, but broad. But why I don't trust it is because it's a bit uncertain how much it's going to give you. Like in this case, it didn't give you anything because it's already enough. But like on the back end, it's making a judgment of what you want. And I'm not sure what kind of judgment they're making. Are they making like based on a paragraph, based on sentence? So you may not get what you want. But just showing you the two ways to do this, I would resort to just clicking on the hyperlink. Yeah, last thing are about memos. So after every coding cycle, we create what is called an analytical memo. And there are very different ways to do this, to do memos, some theoretical and some memo is to summarize document, reflect on what you have seen in that coding cycle. That's just the objective. And if you go to the N-vivo page, there is an option to create memos. And on my end, it's right here. So it's under Notes, Memos. So you click that, I'll put that aside, and you should see like, an entry, Memo 1, initial coding. And you can just right click here and click New Memo. Essentially, once you create a new memo, you should see a blank file. So this is something I've added in. You should see a completely blank file, and think of it as a Word file, because you can click on it, you can type, you can bold, you can do everything you want. The template that I have used for documenting memos that are not as theoretical are as follows. So having, the title of it, what round of coding and what round of initial coding or focus coding, having the current schema. So for the first pilot coding, we won't have this because we're developing a schema. We'll have what recommendations we have for the schema, and underneath the current coding schema is the themes that we thought were relevant. So from the nodes within the same template, there's personal motivations and there's external factors, which I have decided to separate into two separate themes because they are nuanced, separate. They're sufficiently nuanced, independent. But those are two themes that I've decided to say. Let's say hypothetically. So that's what we included. And underneath each, we just include relevant nuance, relevant codes, relevant context. So personal motivations can be, for example, the person wants to avoid withdrawal symptoms, therefore they're motivated to engage in OU treatment. Like they really hate symptoms. That's a personal motivation that I have chosen to classify as such. An external factor could be, a peer, a friend, a family who is also dealing with an OUD, is supporting the individual to undergo treatment. An external factor, because even though there's an element of, acknowledging that peer, that family, that friend, it's still outside their motivation. So this is just like I've described all this other stuff, but in that memo, I've kept it very straightforward. Later down the line, we'll have later down the line, this is the template we'll use. So we'll get the schema from our previous coding, we'll put it here. Then with the new coding and the new cycle, we'll have quite a few suggestions on how to improve the schema, add new themes, collapse themes, separate themes, add new codes, new nuances, all kinds of stuff. All of that goes in the proposed changes to the coding schema, and that allows you to bring to the discussion, what we should do with the schema and how to make it more robust and reflective of the data we receive. Analytical directions for findings and discussion. That's just like this fleeting thoughts that, this person mentioned this, and I think that this can be very powerful, or a research question in of itself, or I don't know, it just seems very important to me. It could be for whatever reason. You don't need a justification or anything. It could be like a sixth sense, like, I feel that this is amazing. Just put it down and we can discuss it, because oftentimes these fleeting thoughts, like our mind is working unconsciously in particular ways that sometimes you can't articulate why this seems important to you, but with discussion, with collaborative discussions, you begin to understand that, this can be very important. So this is where you put down everything that you think is relevant but cannot describe or don't have enough data to support. And these are generally very interpretive statements. They're very much beyond what you're looking at. So if you do make interpretations that you think are super, super relevant in initial coding, just jot them down very quickly here, bring it to discussion. And we can use that as an analytical direction while we do focus coding. And finally, a space for other comments. That's the memo, and we code those memo at the end of every coding cycle, and also at the end of every coding cycle, in addition to the memo, we have a group meeting, and that group meeting is basically everyone reviews each other's memos, and we will just go round table and discuss what those memos entail and work through some of the issues. So for the first meeting, we'll work through developing a schema, and subsequent meetings we suggest from the additional studies we review. So it will be very much a back and forth. We'll use the schema to apply to new studies, but with new studies, we'll get new themes and we'll modify that that schema we developed initially. Yeah, that is it for me.